The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty auction yard outside Millbrook, Nebraska, as livestock dealer Vernon Curtis prepared for what he hoped would be a profitable day selling off unwanted farm animals. The weekly auction at Curtis Livestock Exchange drew ranchers and farmers from across the state, all looking for bargains on cattle, horses, and other animals that could earn their keep on working operations. Among the crowd of weathered ranchers and sharp-eyed dealers stood Benjamin "Ben" Walker, a 60-year-old horse trainer, whose reputation for working with difficult animals had made him one of the most respected horsemen in the region. Ben owned the Broken Arrow Ranch, a modest spread where he specialized in rescuing and rehabilitating horses that other trainers had given up on as hopeless cases. Ben had come to the auction looking for a young horse he could train for his neighbor's teenage daughter, but as he walked through the holding pens, examining the animals, his attention was drawn to a sight that made his heart sink with anger and disgust. In the smallest, most cramped pen, at the far end of the yard, stood a mule that was clearly in terrible condition. The animal was severely underweight, his coat dull and matted. But what caught Ben's attention most was the mule's left front leg, which hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken and never properly set. The mule stood with all his weight on 3 legs, his head hanging low with exhaustion and pain. "That's Old Blue," said Curtis, appearing beside Ben with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to viewing animals as nothing more than commodities. Previous owner brought him in to be sold for dog food. Broke his leg about 6 months ago and never bothered to have it treated. Ben felt rage building in his chest as he studied the suffering animal. 6 months. This mule has been standing on 3 legs for 6 months. Worthless as tits on a bull now, Curtis replied with a shrug. Can't work, can't carry a load, can't even walk properly. But somebody might want him for dog food or glue. Starting the bidding at $50, Ben looked at the mule more closely and saw something in the animal's eyes that spoke to his horseman's soul. Despite his obvious pain and neglect, the mule held his head with dignity, his dark eyes alert and intelligent. This wasn't a broken-down animal ready to give up. This was a creature that had endured months of agony while maintaining his spirit. "Curtis," Ben said quietly, "what would it take to buy this mule before the auction?" Curtis looked surprised. "You want Old Blue?" "Ben, that mule's got maybe a week left in him. Waste of money." "How much?" "Well, if you're fool enough to want him, I'll take $100 and save myself the trouble of putting him through the ring." Ben pulled out his wallet without hesitation. "Done. This incredible rescue story is just getting started. You won't believe what happens when the whole town finds out about Ben's act of kindness. Hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories." The transaction was completed quickly, with Curtis clearly amazed that anyone would pay good money for what he considered a worthless animal. As Ben arranged for a trailer to transport the mule to his ranch, he became aware that their conversation had drawn the attention of several other buyers at the auction. Ben Walker's lost his mind. He heard one rancher mutter to another, "Paying $100 for a 3-legged mule, that ought to be put down." "Always knew he was soft-hearted to a fault," added another voice. "But this is just throwing money away." The comments stung, but Ben ignored them as he focused on the more immediate problem of getting the injured mule safely to his ranch. Loading Blue into the trailer required patience and careful maneuvering, as the animal could barely walk and was clearly in constant pain. During the 20-minute drive to his ranch, Ben found himself talking to the mule through the trailer's open window, his voice gentle and reassuring, despite knowing the animal probably couldn't hear him over the road noise. "Easy, boy," Ben said. "I know you're hurting, but we're going to fix you up. You just hang on a little longer." When they arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch, Ben's wife Margaret emerged from the house to help with the new arrival. Margaret had been married to Ben for 35 years and had long since given up trying to talk him out of his rescue projects. But even she was shocked by the condition of the mule he'd brought home. "Oh, Ben," she said softly, her hand going to her heart as she watched the mule struggle to get out of the trailer. "That poor creature. How could anyone let an animal suffer like this?" "Same way they let people suffer," Ben replied grimly. "By deciding that some lives don't matter." With Margaret's help, Ben managed to get Blue settled in a large, comfortable stall in the main barn. The mule immediately lay down on the thick bed of straw Ben had prepared, clearly exhausted from the short journey. But his eyes remained alert, following Ben's movements with obvious intelligence. "What's the plan?" Margaret asked, as they stood outside the stall watching their new charge. "First, we call Dr. Rodriguez to look at that leg," Ben said. "Then we see what's possible." Dr. Maria Rodriguez arrived 2 hours later. her veterinary truck fully equipped with portable X-ray equipment and surgical supplies. Maria had worked with Ben on dozens of rescue cases over the years, and she'd learned not to question his judgment when it came to animals that others had written off. The examination took nearly an hour, with Dr. Rodriguez carefully studying X-rays and assessing the extent of the damage to Blue's leg. When she finally emerged from the stall, her expression was grave. "Ben, the break is old and badly healed," she reported. "The bones have fused in the wrong position, and there's significant muscle atrophy from months of non-use. Honestly, the most humane thing would probably be to put him down." "What about surgery?" Ben asked. "Could the leg be rebroken and set properly?" Dr. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "It's possible, but it would be extremely expensive, very risky, and there's no guarantee of success. Even if everything went perfectly, he'd never be sound enough for hard work. You'd be looking at thousands of dollars for an animal that would essentially be a pasture pet." Ben looked through the stall window at the mule, who was watching their conversation with obvious interest despite his exhaustion. "What do you think, Blue?" Ben asked the animal. "You want to give it a try?" As if in response, the mule lifted his head and made a soft sound that Margaret would later swear sounded like agreement. "Schedule the surgery," Ben said to Dr. Rodriguez, "and do whatever it takes to give him the best chance." "Ben, are you sure about this?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "We're talking about a minimum of $5,000, and that's if everything goes well." "I'm sure," Ben replied without hesitation. Some things are more important than money. Over the next 3 days, as they prepared for Blue's surgery, word of Ben's expensive rescue spread throughout the community of Millbrook and the surrounding ranching area. The reaction was swift and almost universally negative. At Miller's feed store, the local gathering place for ranchers and farmers, the consensus was that Ben Walker had finally lost his mind. $5,000 for a broken-down mule, scoffed cattle rancher Jack Morrison. "That's more than most people around here make in a month." "Always said Ben was too soft for this business," added horse dealer Pete Jameson. "You can't save every animal, especially ones that aren't worth saving. It's just throwing good money after bad," declared banker Thomas Reed. "That mule's never going to be worth anything, even if the surgery works." The criticism reached Ben through various channels, overheard conversations in town, comments from neighbors, even a few direct confrontations from people who felt compelled to share their opinions about his foolish decision. "Ben, I respect what you're trying to do," said his neighbor, Frank Cooper, "but you've got to draw the line somewhere. That mule's suffered enough. The kindest thing would be to end his misery." Ben listened to all the criticism with patience, but he never wavered in his decision. He'd seen something in Blue's eyes that convinced him the mule still had the will to live, and Ben had never abandoned an animal that was willing to fight for survival. The morning of the surgery, as Dr. Rodriguez prepared to transport Blue to the veterinary hospital in Lincoln, Ben made one final check on his patient. The mule was standing in his stall, still favoring his injured leg, but alert and responsive. "You ready for this, boy?" Ben asked, stroking the mule's neck. "It's going to be rough, but I think you're tougher than most people give you credit for." Blue nuzzled Ben's hand gently, as if to say he understood the risk but was ready to take the chance. As the trailer pulled away from the ranch, Ben found himself saying a silent prayer for the success of what everyone else considered a foolish gamble on a worthless animal. The long road to recovery, the surgery to repair Blue's leg, took 6 hours, with Dr. Rodriguez and her surgical team working carefully to re-break the badly healed bones and set them in proper alignment. The procedure was complicated by the months of malunion and the mule's weakened condition, but Blue's vital signs remained stable throughout the operation. The surgery went as well as we could have hoped, Dr. Rodriguez told Ben when she called that evening. "We were able to correct the alignment, and the bones are now properly positioned. But the real test will be whether Blue has the strength and determination to handle the recovery process." The recovery would be long and challenging. Blue would need to remain in the veterinary hospital for 2 weeks, then return to Ben's ranch for months of careful rehabilitation. The mule would have to relearn how to walk properly, rebuild the muscle mass he'd lost, and adapt to using his repaired leg. "What are his chances?" Ben asked. "Honestly, maybe 50-50, Dr. Rodriguez replied. "But if any animal can beat those odds, it's this one. He's got more fight in him than I've seen in years." During Blue's hospital stay, Ben visited every day, bringing apples and carrots and spending hours talking to the mule about anything and everything. Margaret often accompanied him, and she was amazed by the obvious bond that had developed between her husband and the injured animal. "He listens to you," Margaret observed one afternoon, as they watched Blue respond to Ben's voice by lifting his head and pricking his ears forward. It's like he understands that you're the reason he's getting this chance. The criticism from the community continued, and even intensified, as people learned the full extent of Ben's investment in Blue's care. The surgery and hospital stay had cost over $6,000, with additional expenses for rehabilitation, equipment and ongoing veterinary care. Ben Walker's spending more on that mule than most folks spend on their kids' college education. Banker Thomas Reed complained loudly at the local diner. It's irresponsible. He's got a right to spend his money however he wants, defended Sarah Mitchell, the town librarian. At least he's trying to help something instead of just complaining about everything. There's a difference between helping and throwing money away, Reed shot back. That mule's never going to be worth a fraction of what Ben spent on him. When Blue was finally ready to return to the ranch, Ben had converted one of his horse stalls into a specialized recovery area with soft footing, carefully placed rails for support, and easy access to food and water. The mule's leg was still encased in a protective cast, and he moved with obvious stiffness. But he was walking on all four legs for the first time in months. Look at that, Margaret said, with tears in her eyes, as they watched Blue take his first tentative steps in his new home. He's actually walking. The rehabilitation process was slow and sometimes frustrating. Blue had to rebuild not just his physical strength, but also his confidence in using the repaired leg. Some days he made noticeable progress. Other days he seemed to regress, favoring the leg and moving with obvious discomfort. Ben worked with Blue every day, leading him through carefully designed exercises and gradually increasing the distance and duration of their walks around the ranch. He also began teaching the mule basic commands and tricks, partly for mental stimulation, but mostly because he'd noticed how much Blue seemed to enjoy learning new things. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" Ben said one afternoon, as Blue successfully navigated a series of ground poles that helped him practice lifting his feet properly. "Too smart to give up, even when everyone else thought you should." 3 months after the surgery, Dr. Rodriguez removed Blue's cast and pronounced the healing process a complete success. The mule's leg was straight and strong, with no sign of the devastating injury that had nearly ended his life. "I have to admit, Ben, I didn't think he'd make it this far," Dr. Rodriguez said, as she watched Blue trot freely around his paddock. "But he's proved us all wrong. That leg is as good as new." "What about his future?" Ben asked. "Can he do normal mule work?" "He'll never be a heavy draft animal," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "But for light riding, packing, or farm work, absolutely. You've given him back his life." As word spread through Millbrook that Blue had made a full recovery, the community's attitude toward Ben's rescue began to shift. Some people remained critical, viewing the expense as wasteful regardless of the outcome. But others began to see Ben's persistence in a different light. "You know what?" said Frank Cooper, the neighbor who had originally criticized Ben's decision. "I was wrong about that mule. Takes a special kind of determination to come back from an injury like that." The real test of Blue's recovery came 6 months after his surgery, when Ben decided to start riding him on short trails around the ranch. The mule had always been intelligent and eager to please, but now he seemed to understand that his second chance at life was a gift to be treasured. "He's the most grateful animal I've ever worked with," Ben told Margaret as they watched Blue respond immediately to even the slightest touch of the reins. "It's like he knows exactly what happened to him and who's responsible for his recovery." Blue's gentle nature and willing attitude made him perfect for teaching beginning riders. Ben began using him in his training programs for children and nervous adults, and the mule's calm patience and steady gaits quickly made him everyone's favorite. "That mule's worth his weight in gold as a lesson horse," observed riding instructor Jenny Parks after watching Blue carefully take care of a frightened 8-year-old during her first riding lesson. "He seems to know exactly how much a rider can handle." As Blue's reputation as an exceptional lesson horse grew, people began coming from surrounding counties, specifically to ride the mule that had been rescued from the dog food buyer. Parents who were nervous about putting their children on horses felt confident with Blue, and many adult beginners found the courage to start riding because of his gentle, trustworthy nature. "You know what the funny thing is?" Ben said to Margaret one evening as they watched Blue giving a riding lesson to a group of local teenagers. "Everyone said I was throwing money away on a worthless animal. Now that worthless mule is booked solid for lessons 3 months in advance." But Ben's vindication was about to become much more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. And it would come from a source that would shock the entire community. An unexpected visitor, the transformation of Blue from a crippled, discarded mule to a beloved lesson horse had taken nearly a year, but Ben had never regretted his decision to save the animal. Blue had not only made a complete physical recovery, but had also developed into one of the most reliable and gentle mounts Ben had ever worked with. His reputation had spread throughout Nebraska's horse community, and people regularly traveled hours to ride the famous rescue mule. On a crisp October morning, Ben was working with Blue in the training arena when Margaret called out from the ranch house that he had visitors. Ben looked up to see two men approaching from the parking area. One was obviously a cowboy, wearing well-worn boots, jeans, and a hat that had seen many years of ranch work. The other was dressed more formally in slacks and a button-down shirt, carrying what appeared to be a briefcase. "Mr. Walker," the formally dressed man called out as they approached. "My name is David Chen, and I'm a documentary filmmaker from California. This is my friend and colleague, Tom Bradley. We're here about your mule." Ben dismounted from Blue and walked over to meet the visitors, curious about what interest a California filmmaker could have in his rescued mule. "What kind of documentary?" Ben asked, shaking hands with both men. "We're working on a film about animal rescue and rehabilitation," Chen explained. "Tom here told me about Blue's story, and we drove out from California specifically to meet him and hear about his recovery." Tom Bradley stepped forward with a smile that seemed both familiar and emotional. "Mr. Walker, I should explain my connection to your mule. I'm the original owner of Blue or Thunder, as I called him back then." Ben felt his heart skip a beat. "You're the one who sent him to the auction?" "No, sir," Bradley replied quickly. "I sold Thunder to a man named Vernon Garrett about 2 years ago, when I had to downsize my operation due to health problems. Garrett assured me he was looking for a good mule for light farm work and trail riding. I had no idea he was neglecting Thunder, or that he'd ended up at a dog food auction." Ben studied Bradley's face and could see genuine distress in the older man's eyes. "You didn't know about his injury?" "Not until last month, when I heard through the horse community that Ben Walker had rescued a mule matching Thunder's description," Bradley said. "I've been feeling sick about it ever since. I trusted Garrett to take care of him, and instead, that bastard, excuse my language, let him suffer for months with a broken leg." Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out some papers. "Mr. Walker, Tom has asked me to document Blue's story, not just for the film, but because he wants to make things right. Tom is the president of the Rocky Mountain Mule Association, and when word got out about what happened to Thunder, the entire mule community was outraged." "What do you mean?" Ben asked. Bradley's voice grew emotional as he explained. "Mr. Walker, you saved Thunder's life when no one else would even try. You spent thousands of dollars on an animal that most people considered worthless. The mule community has been talking about your kindness for months, and we decided we needed to do something to honor what you did." "That's not necessary," Ben said quickly. "I didn't do it for recognition." "We know that," Chen replied. "That's exactly why the mule community wants to honor you. Tomorrow morning, we're organizing something that we hope will show our appreciation for your compassion and dedication." "What kind of something?" Ben asked suspiciously. Bradley grinned. "You'll have to wait and see. But I promise you, it's going to be special." That evening, Chen and Bradley joined Ben and Margaret for dinner, during which they learned more about Blue's original history. Thunder had been born on Bradley's ranch in Colorado and had shown exceptional intelligence and gentleness from an early age. He'd been Bradley's personal mount for trail riding and had even competed in several mule shows, winning ribbons for his calm demeanor and willing attitude. "Thunder was my favorite," Bradley said with obvious affection as he watched the mule grazing peacefully in the paddock outside the kitchen window. "When my doctor told me I had to retire and sell most of my animals, it broke my heart to let him go. I thought I'd found him a good home with Garrett." "What happened to Garrett?" Margaret asked. "He's been blacklisted from every horse and mule organization in 3 states, Bradley replied grimly. "When people found out what he did to Thunder, the backlash was swift and severe. He'll never be able to buy or sell livestock through legitimate channels again." Chen had been filming their conversation for his documentary, and he was clearly moved by the obvious bond between Ben and Blue. "Mr. Walker, what made you decide to take such an expensive risk on an animal that everyone else had written off?" Ben considered the question carefully. "I looked in his eyes and saw an animal that hadn't given up on life. He was in pain. He was neglected. He was unwanted, but he still had fight in him. How could I walk away from that?" "Most people would have," Chen observed. "Most people see animals as commodities," Ben replied. "But every animal has value beyond what they can produce, or how much they cost. Blue taught me that sometimes the most worthless things in the world turn out to be the most precious." The next morning, Ben was awakened by the sound of vehicles coming up the ranch road. When he looked out his bedroom window, he was stunned to see a line of horse trailers and pickup trucks stretching as far as he could see down the county road. "Margaret," Ben called to his wife. "You need to see this." By the time Ben and Margaret had dressed and made it outside, their ranch yard was filled with people unloading horses and mules from trailers. Men and women of all ages, dressed in riding gear and carrying saddles, were organizing what appeared to be a massive trail ride. Tom Bradley approached with a huge smile on his face. "Ben, I'd like you to meet some friends of yours." "Friends?" Ben asked, bewildered by the scene unfolding around him. "Members of Mule associations from 12 states, Bradley explained. "When word got out about what you did for Thunder, people started organizing. They've driven here from as far away as Texas and Montana to participate in what we're calling the Thunder Trail Ride." Ben looked around at the crowd of riders and counted at least 100 people preparing their mounts. "All these people came here because of Blue." "Because of what you did for Blue," Bradley corrected. "You showed the kind of compassion and dedication that the Mule community values above everything else. These people wanted to honor that." A woman approached leading a beautiful bay mule. "Mr. Walker, I'm Susan Davis from the Colorado Mule Association. I drove 14 hours to be here today because what you did for that mule represents everything we believe in about the value of these animals. I brought my whole family," added a man with 3 teenagers in tow. "My kids needed to see what it looks like when someone puts their money where their mouth is about animal welfare." As more riders introduced themselves and shared their reasons for making the journey to Ben's ranch, the rancher began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. These weren't just casual horse enthusiasts. These were serious mule people who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor his rescue of Blue. "How many riders are there?" Ben asked Bradley. "Final count is 307, Bradley replied with pride. "Plus about 50 support vehicles and the film crew. It's the largest gathering of mules in Nebraska history." The logistics of organizing 300 riders for a trail ride around Ben's ranch was staggering. But the mule community had planned everything down to the smallest detail. Trail bosses had mapped out routes that would accommodate the large group. Veterinarians were on standby for any injuries, and support vehicles carried water and emergency supplies. "Mr. Walker," called out the trail boss, a weathered cowboy named Jim Robertson, "we'd like you and Thunder to lead the ride, if you're willing." Ben looked at Blue, who was watching the organized chaos with obvious interest, his ears pricked forward and his expression alert. "What do you think, boy? Ready to be the star of the show?" As if he understood exactly what was being asked of him, Blue stepped forward and nuzzled Ben's shoulder, then looked out at the assembled riders with what could only be described as pride. The ride of a lifetime, the Thunder Trail Ride, began at exactly 9 a.m., with Ben and Blue leading a procession of 307 mules and their riders down the county road from the Broken Arrow Ranch. The sight was unprecedented in Nebraska. A river of mules stretching for over a mile, their riders representing the largest gathering of mule enthusiasts in the state's history. Local law enforcement had been notified about the ride, and Sheriff Deputy Mike Torres was directing traffic as the massive group made its way along the rural roads. Cars pulled over to let the procession pass, with many drivers getting out to take pictures of the extraordinary sight. "Never seen anything like it in 30 years of law enforcement," Deputy Torres told a reporter from the Millbrook Gazette, who was covering the event. "These folks came from all over the country just to honor one man's kindness to a rescued mule." At the head of the procession, Ben found himself overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. Blue stepped out proudly, his head held high and his gait steady and confident. The mule seemed to understand that he was the guest of honor at this remarkable gathering, and he carried himself with a dignity that brought tears to Ben's eyes. "Look at him," Margaret said to Tom Bradley, as they rode near the front of the group. "Blue knows this is all about him. He's absolutely glowing with pride." The trail ride had been carefully planned to showcase both the beautiful Nebraska countryside and to tell the story of Blue's rescue and recovery. The route took the riders past the auction yard where Ben had first found the injured mule, then through the scenic hills and valleys around Millbrook before returning to the ranch for a celebration. Barbecue. As they passed the Curtis Livestock Exchange, Vernon Curtis himself emerged from his office to watch the procession. The sight of hundreds of mules and riders brought a scowl to his face, especially when he recognized Blue at the head of the group. "That's the mule I sold to Ben Walker," Curtis told his assistant. "Fool paid $100 for a 3-legged animal that should have been dog food. Looks like he got his money's worth," the assistant observed. Watching Blue step proudly past the auction yard, where his ordeal had nearly ended. Word of the Thunder Trail ride had spread throughout the community, and people lined the roads to watch the remarkable procession pass by. At Miller's feed store, the same ranchers who had criticized Ben's decision to save Blue stood outside watching in amazement. "I'll be damned," muttered cattle rancher Jack Morrison. "Must be 300 riders out there. All because Ben Walker saved a broken-down mule," added Pete Jameson, shaking his head in wonder. "Maybe the mule wasn't as worthless as we thought," suggested Frank Cooper, who had been one of Ben's harshest critics. The impact of seeing 300 riders who had traveled from across the country specifically to honor Ben's compassion was beginning to change minds throughout Millbrook. People who had mocked Ben's wasteful spending were starting to understand that the value of his action went far beyond dollars and cents. When the trail ride reached the scenic overlook above Miller's Creek, Tom Bradley called for a halt so that documentary filmmaker David Chen could capture some footage of the historic gathering. The sight of hundreds of mules and riders spread across the hillside was breathtaking, with the Nebraska prairie stretching to the horizon in all directions. "Ben Walker," Bradley announced through a portable speaker system, "on behalf of mule enthusiasts throughout America, we want to thank you for showing the world what these animals mean to those who love them." The response was thunderous, hundreds of riders cheering, whooping, and applauding while their mules added their own voices, with brazen calls that echoed across the valley. Blue stood at the center of it all, calm and dignified, as if he'd been born to be the focus of such attention. "You saved more than just one mule's life," Bradley continued. "You reminded all of us why we fell in love with these animals in the first place. Your kindness and dedication represent the best of what the mule community stands for." A young girl, named Sarah Peterson, who had traveled from Montana with her family, rode forward on her mule and presented Ben with a special halter that had been crafted by leather workers from 6 different states. The halter was beautifully tooled with images of mules and inscribed with the words "Thunder's Second Chance," a symbol of hope. "Mr. Walker," Sarah said in a clear voice that carried across the hillside, "this halter represents the love and respect of everyone who believes that every animal deserves a chance at life." As Ben accepted the gift and placed it on Blue's head, the crowd erupted in another round of applause. Blue stood perfectly still for the ceremony, as if he understood the significance of the moment. The trail ride continued for another 2 hours, winding through some of the most beautiful country in Nebraska, before returning to the Broken Arrow Ranch for the celebration barbecue. Local restaurants had donated food, and volunteers from the mule associations had organized games and activities for children. But the most moving moment of the day came when Dr. Maria Rodriguez addressed the gathering, sharing the medical details of Blue's recovery and the challenges he had overcome. "When Ben brought this mule to me for surgery," Dr. Rodriguez said, "I honestly didn't think he'd survive the operation. The injury was severe, the prognosis was poor, and most veterinarians would have recommended euthanasia." She gestured toward Blue, who was grazing peacefully nearby, surrounded by children who were feeding him carrots and apples. But Ben saw something in this animal that the rest of us missed. He saw potential where others saw only problems. He saw value where others saw only expense. And because of his faith and determination, we're all witnesses to a miracle. The veterinarian's words brought many in the crowd to tears, including some of the hardened ranchers who had made the long journey to Nebraska. "That mule is living proof that every life has value," said rancher Bill Martinez from Texas. "What Ben did reminds us all that sometimes the most important thing we can do is give someone or some animal a second chance." As the celebration continued into the evening, Ben found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been just another horse trainer going about his business, unknown outside his local community. Today, he was being honored by hundreds of people who had traveled thousands of miles to celebrate his act of compassion. "Any regrets?" Margaret asked as they sat on their porch watching the last of the trailers pull out of their yard. "Only one," Ben replied, stroking Blue's neck as the mule stood beside his chair. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what Blue was trying to teach me." "What's that?" "That the value of a life can't be measured in dollars," Ben said softly, "and that sometimes the most broken things in the world just need someone who believes they're worth fixing." As the stars appeared in the clear Nebraska sky, Ben and Margaret sat with Blue in comfortable silence, surrounded by the letters, cards, and gifts that had poured in from mule enthusiasts around the world. The Thunder Trail ride had been featured on national news, and Ben's story had inspired similar rescue efforts across the country. But for Ben, the real reward wasn't the recognition or the media attention. It was the quiet moment each morning, When Blue greeted him with a gentle nicker, healthy and happy, and ready for whatever the day might bring, the mule that everyone had written off as worthless had become priceless not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented, about the power of compassion and the importance of never giving up on those who need help the most. If this incredible story about compassion, second chances, and the power of believing in the worthless moved your heart, smash that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories about people who see value where others see only problems. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that every life has value and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is give someone a second chance. Comment below and tell us about a time when you helped someone or something that others had given up on. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring stories. Remember, the most broken things in the world sometimes just need someone who believes they're worth fixing. This remarkable story reminds us that true worth isn't measured by productivity or profit, but by the intrinsic value of every living being. Ben Walker's decision to save Blue when everyone else saw only expense and futility demonstrates the kind of compassion that changes not just individual lives, but entire communities. The Thunder Trail ride stands as a testament to the ripple effects of kindness, how one person's willingness to see potential instead of problems can inspire hundreds of others to travel across the country to celebrate that vision. Blue's transformation from a discarded, suffering animal to a beloved symbol of hope proves that second chances, when given with love and determination, can create miracles that touch hearts far beyond what we ever imagined possible.